You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we look forward to seeing you there.
This is Steve Sansweet of Rancho Obi-Wan, and you're listening to the 602 Club.
Welcome to TFM's local watering hole, the 602 Club. I'm your host here, Matthew Rushing, and so excited to be back with my good friend, John Mills, this week. John, it's great to have you back. I feel like we should get you a really nice guest room.
Yes, you should.
Wow.
I'm not giving you any more than that. I just said, yes, you should. You offered and I accepted.
Oh, man. Well, I hope Ruby has gotten you the good stuff tonight, because we're going to have an enjoyable time, I think, being able to discuss the brand new Thrawn book that came out last month. And this is part of the Thrawn Ascendancy series. This book is called Greater Good, and so this should be a lot of fun to dive into. Want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's listening, and of course, if you're subscribed to the podcast, make sure you're subscribed, because that you will get the show as soon as it drops. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please hit us up with a star rating review. Let people know what you think of the show. We love for more people to continue to find the show. So also, you can check us out on Twitter at the 602 Club. We're on Instagram at 602 Club TFM, so please follow us on both places. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/TrackFM. We've got the listeners-only discussion group there, the Babel Conference, where you can talk to listeners from all over the world about what's going on the network and the different shows. And, of course, you can find us on Trek.fm, and then there's the contact section where you can send us an email as well. Huge thank you, though, to our associate producers, Ken Tripp and Davis Grayson, Ryan Millette, Daniel Noah. We do appreciate them supporting the network through Patreon. Now, this network is different than a lot because there's no ads here. So if you like the fact that we bring you great ad-free content as much as possible, go over to patreon.com/TrekFM. In fact, that's really the only way that the show and the network can continue to grow. So, again, that's patreon.com/TrekFM. So, John, diving into the Ascendancy series, we talked about this in the first one, the first episode that we did on the first book that came out. But one of the things that has been so much of a joy in this is that, you know, the Chiss as a species were always teased. And finally, Thrawn has really gotten to, I would say, world create with this series and finally give us everything we could possibly want to know about the Chiss. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me is just how much more we learn about the Chiss in the first place in this. And, you know, we heard about the 9 ruling families, which, you know, are these almost Game of Thrones-like characters, families that kind of rule over the Chiss. But this book really expands on that and giving us more detail, and the fact that under the 9 ruling families, we then have 40 great families, and then there's a section below that as well. So really fleshing out the kind of galactic implications of the entire Chiss Ascendancy, what it looks like, and that the government is, you know, the 9 ruling families almost feels like more of somewhat of a executive and legislative branch in place. Mm-hmm. And then the 40 great ruling families also feels like almost another, like almost like Congress to Senate or something like that. To me, I just really appreciated that we are continuing to deepen the Chiss Ascendancy and really create something I think that is special in Star Wars, in the sense that this may end up being the race we know the absolute most about by the time the series is done.
Yeah, there is, I think to your point about the Ascendancy, it's, in a sense, it's like this ultimate meritocracy. Nobody gets elected, but people get chosen. So you have this oligarchical structure. We also establish here that there are those who will never attain the level of influence and power. We meet the common rancher. Mm-hmm. And so it's very feudal, and it's very while being like that's the thing, is what Zahn deserves credit for, is that it's hard to quantify it as a singular thing.
Right.
You're right that it's like a Game of Thrones sort of thing, but it's also like a legislative and executive branch, but it's also feudal, but it's also a meritocracy, but it's also all of these things. And it's really interesting because it works. It makes sense as he goes through it. You say, oh, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Sure. And then if you step back for a second, you say, no, that doesn't really, how on earth would this work? But at the same time, what he's setting up, what I think he's really setting up very well, is why the Chiss are unable to expand beyond where they are. The Empire can keep conquering and expanding. The Republic can keep bringing worlds in. The Chiss Ascendancy is limited by its own ambitions, if that makes any sense. Everybody they bring in has to become basically a part of the fold. Well, there's only so large you can grow the family before it becomes untenable. And I'm wondering if during this whole ascendancy thing, we're witnessing the point in history where it does become untenable. And Thrawn is that sort of free agent that causes things to start eroding and breaking down.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question that I hadn't thought of, that you bring up. Is this... Because, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the things that Thrawn tells the Republic when he's found on that planet is that he's been exiled, basically. And we get, obviously, that feeling that they're working against Thrawn and everything. But, you're right. Like, one of the things that was this whole idea of, like, you hit on the idea that the Chiss Ascendancy couldn't grow any bigger, and maybe it doesn't really even want to grow any bigger. They don't seem to have aspirations necessarily outside their borders. They're pretty protective. And one of the things that Jinxtus does as an allusion to the Chiss Ascendancy is he they have that big migratory scene with the birds, and he's kind of pointing out that these birds, you have the predator birds that are on the outside and the weaker birds on the inside, and how this seems to almost be a slight metaphor for the Chiss Ascendancy in itself, that it keeps a strong border to keep everything in check inside its borders, and in some ways you create the protective barrier, and you protect the more vulnerable to the benefit of the whole. And yet, like you said, it would be difficult for you to continue that type of structure if you got much bigger than what you already are.
Right. Well, you would have to take into consideration as well that it becomes stability and balance becomes incredibly necessary as a means of survival. And so you could reach in for the metaphor that when, and I'm going to preface this by saying I'm going to be struggling with names for this whole thing because they truly are alien names.
They are very,
and it's, I remember Haplif, and it's Stimkiv, whatever, the female that's traveling.
Oh, yes, I know who you're talking about, yeah.
When she poisons the ground, not to kill all the birds, but to make it less habitable, and they all change their pattern. And that shows how just the tiniest bit of influence that's unexpected from outside the Ascendancy, if these birds are a metaphor for the Ascendancy, one little poison changes the way everything goes.
Yes. Absolutely, and that's definitely a big part of the story and the plan that Haplif has as well, and something we'll talk, I would say, in super detail about, because it really is the biggest part of the story, but it's also, I would say, the biggest thematic element of the book as well, too. So, no, I think this is the thing, is that Star Wars very rarely brings species to life like this. Everything is pretty monochromatic with species that we see. We definitely you think about like the Gamorreans, right? You don't really think of them as being nuanced in any way. I honestly, I would say the closest nuance that we've gotten for any other race in Star Wars has actually been the Mandalorians. After what we got in the Clone Wars and then what we're getting in the Mandalorian, it's like we're really getting some serious nuance to that species. Otherwise, I guess, the Jedi, of course, there's nuance there, but as it comes to understanding a specific species or race in Star Wars, there aren't many where you have this kind of detail.
True, but by the same token, in the prequels, there's very much a sense that where we're meeting them is in the public square. And even though it's cut from episode 2, there is an effort to show what life was like on Naboo for Padme when she was growing up and how different it was from the life that Anakin had. And so there are hints of the nuance there, but of course you can't go into as much depth as you do in a book series, to your point, for sure. And I think what it is with the Chiss is what's interesting about their structure and about the whole approach to it. I'm pretty sure we hit on this in the first book too, is we're creating something that is truly living, interesting, and unlike what we've gotten before. And what's super interesting is with the exception of a few terms that we hear, right? This series is exactly what some people have been saying they want out of Star Wars.
Sure.
We've got no Jedi. We've got no possibility of Jedi here.
True. Yeah, really.
We've got no lightsabers. We've got acknowledgement of the Force, but it's not understood as such.
Right.
And it touches all of the species here, but they don't process it in the same way that the people do in the rest of the galaxy.
Absolutely.
And so there's a very, very interesting phenomenon here, and it really jumped out at me with this book, and I think what made it such a joy to read was I felt like the Chiss belonged in Star Wars, but it's a completely separate thing. If you strip the Star Wars branding from this, it would be pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
This is just a really good science fiction story, but it's given just enough of those markers of what's established about what I love before it that I instantly accept it as part of the larger galaxy.
I mean, 100%. And, one of the things with the Chiss that we kind of dive a little bit more into, and I thought was a really fascinating little side detail that, we have the Skywalkers, and Thalos is talking to the mid captain of Thrawn's ship, and
Samacro. That's the one name I can remember. Samacro.
And he's talking about, that they have a schedule for when to bring Skywalkers out of the third site, as they're guiding ships. And she says, well, for Sherry, actually, it's better if she goes like 10 minutes beyond that time. And so it's not on this, schedule. It's not cut and dry. And that there has to be some kind of wiggle room there in the regulations. And they have this great conversation about, do we do what is easy or do we do what is best? And the fact that what is good for some is not always good for everyone, because not everybody's the same. Right. And it brings up, I thought, really interestingly then, he's in a very subtle way discussing the idea of the title, which is greater good. And greater good doesn't necessarily mean the good of all, right? And so I really loved that in that small discussion, you are finding one of the larger thematic elements of the entire book, because it even implies what we're kind of seeing with the political struggles of the people seeing Thrawn as not being a part of the greater good himself, because he doesn't play the game the same way that others. In fact, he's not even playing a game. This is not a game to him, right? And so I think what I was really impressed was the way in which Zahn is able to create these wonderful thematic connection points throughout the book in very different and sometimes I would say surprising ways.
Yeah, and I still go back and forth as to whether Thrawn is quote-unquote playing a game or not. because he's so intelligent. I really think, how many battles have we seen him in through these 2 books wherein he is feigning ignorance of a situation until the key moment? And I still going forward with this 3rd book that's going to come out, I'm still sitting there saying, okay, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop to find out Thrawn has been screwing with everybody and he actually gets how the game is played and he's just playing them. He's viewing it as a battle sort of thing, because his whole thing is he has a desire to learn the political game. And so I refuse to believe that he hasn't been studying it from his perspective, from the way he would approach things. I could be completely wrong, but I think that speaks to the character and the depth that Zahn is really giving him, because there were 2 things that really jump out as well about his character in the context of the Ascendancy as a whole. Thrawn is a bad guy. We all love him, but he's a bad guy. Look at what he does to the Bendu. Look at the trouble he causes for our space family and Rebels. He's not a good person, but he seems to be a good person in this context, in that he's quote unquote not playing the game. And then you could say, well, maybe he doesn't really learn how to play the game, because obviously he gets bested by Tarkin for which project to support, the TIE Defender or the Death Star. But you could also make the argument that the TIE Defender's off the table because et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of that stuff. But also what I was surprised by in this book was how, and this is going to be an overstatement, but how quote unquote little Thrawn was actually in it. He's moving everything, but he almost takes on a Sidious type of role. Not to that extent. He's not pulling strings like the Godfather sort of thing. But he has an influence on everything that's happening in this story. And he's not directly involved in 100% of it, but it still touches on him. And I just thought it was a very interesting story structure that probably also spoke to, the greater themes and everything, in that Thrawn is not as present in this book as you would expect from a book that has his name on it.
Yeah, that's a really, I know that there are some people, a friend of mine he gets very disenchanted with Thrawn as a character because Thrawn always wins, and, he hasn't necessarily been a fan of the way in which Thrawn is kind of basically presented more in the books, it seems like, with this series, and even, the series where he's part of the Empire, where there's this struggle of seeing him as a bad guy, right? Because so much of what he does is good. But I think one of the most interesting things about Thrawn in general is that I would say his axiom for life is pretty much the Vulcan axiom, which is the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And so, therefore, everything he does seems to fall within that he is doing it for the greater good of the Ascendancy. And what he sees as the greater good is that everyone, he's utilitarian. He's a utilitarianist. The most utility for the most amount of people is the best way to go. And so, therefore, in that very logical flow of thought, and I would say much more logical thought in general, logic can be used in all sorts of terrible ways. And I think Thrawn is a character to which we kind of see the limitations of thinking only logically. And I think that is actually a good thing, because logic divorced of emotion and care and love and all of those type of things becomes very cold. And I think that's the thing that makes Thrawn a villain in the end, is because he is cold and calculating, and his care, there is very little care there. And that is villainous, because it lacks what we would call, quote unquote, the human connection, right? But what we're talking about is that emotional connection to something beyond just its utility. And Thrawn is all about the utility of things. And I think, to me, that's what makes him such a fascinating character, because in and of itself, he's not necessarily a bad person and or character. He's just missing some important characteristics to which allow a person to have an emphasis beyond utility.
Sure. I mean, and that's his lack of empathy is why he succeeds all the time. To answer your friend that you're making a reference to, the reason he always wins is because he doesn't care about other people.
Absolutely.
I gleefully concede that point. I say it in a night, like I actually mean it as a compliment that I'm still not trusting Thrawn completely, not to get what's going on here and not be playing the political game just very slyly and putting the pieces in place sort of thing. That's intended as a compliment because as much time as I have spent with Thrawn by this point in the books, I still don't trust him. And that, I think, also speaks to the underlying fact of him in that I can sit here and say, well, it doesn't really approach him like he's a bad guy. Well, that's true in this context, but that's the problem, is that the ascendancy is actually something that shouldn't be defended as strongly as Thrawn winds up defending it. He's defending a bad thing because he's missing that empathy that other people have.
Yeah. That's
and that's why he can just he's more of a mercenary, honestly, in that he is working to an end where he doesn't care what the overall goals of the ascendancy are. The ascendancy is trying to basically eat itself, like not eat itself, but like it's just one of those things where it's the ascendancy is not a good thing. Yeah. It's a caste system. It's a feudal system. It's, I mean, in all honesty, going back to what we were talking about, where you can't quite quantify it or qualify it. I mean, and I threw the word meritocracy out there. It's actually a false meritocracy because people are advancing other people for their own ends to manipulate them versus other people. So it's not a meritocracy, in fact. I've now talked myself out of it.
And I will say, too, I think it's a great kind of time to jump into this whole idea of wagging the dog and Thurfain, who is the head of the Mitth family, wants to get rid of Thrawn. Why is that? Because Thrawn, like we were talking about, he does not play the game the way that other Chiss play the game and understand the political structure, right? And because he's not willing to play by their rules, he's a threat then to them. And looking bad on their family. And so therefore, I thought it was kind of fascinating the way in which they almost play with this idea, and it was very, topical of like using rumors and hearsay basically on the Twitter sphere of the Chiss Ascendancy to get Thrawn out of the way and have him go hopefully chase ghosts, so that he can hopefully fail. Like they're just praying he fails out there. And he brings, a bad name on himself and that they can get rid of this guy. And all of that comes exactly what you said. It's not because they can't see the merit of Thrawn because he's not playing on the team by the same rules as everybody else. And if you're not going to be a team player like that, then you're no good to us and our end goals, which is to amass more power, like you said. So absolutely, this is not a good system.
So would you say that they're suffering from Thrawn derangement syndrome?
I think that's absolutely what they're suffering from, because they want to get rid of this guy regardless of the fact that he just keeps winning.
Well,
I mean, that's so much winning. I'm tired of winning.
No, but like all of the stuff that Thrawn is doing is he prevents a civil war. He's keeping enemies out. Yep. He just lacks the polish that everybody wants him to have, sort of thing, and he's not a controllable entity.
Yes.
And so it really annoys them. And it gets back to, again, I don't want to be in the position, because he's still a bad guy. I don't want to defend Thrawn. Thrawn's not a good person. But like it's one of these things where it's like I mean, Zahn has taken something here, and I think what he has created over the original 2 Thrawn books and now this trilogy as it goes along, I struggle to think of another author who's written for a different franchise or anything like that, or even for this franchise, who has put such of his own stamp on everything by having the story structured like this, in such a way that I can even go in here, and you mentioned, the political intrigue and everything. Jinxus is essentially a phantom menace that nobody knows about, who's pulling the strings behind the scene, and I desperately want to know more about.
Yep.
And I'm just waiting for that veil to fall. He's literally veiled. Mm-hmm. I want to know everything about this guy because he's familiar while being different. He has such a Sidious flair to him that it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes him a good villain, is that he is playing off the ideas of him being like a Palpatine-like character.
Mm-hmm.
And being somebody who has plans within plans within plans. I mean, obviously, Yiv the Benevolent was a part of his plan, but he knew that it wasn't really going to work. It was just going to be the first destabilizing movement. So he's working in movements. Like this is the second movement in that. And who knows what the third move in it is going to be, right? But I think us not quite knowing exactly who he is as a villain makes it really interesting and makes me want to know more, because he's familiar, and yet is he really like Palpatine, or is that just a veil that'll be unveiled later on? And he has some ripples and nuances that Palpatine doesn't have, so I think that's the kind of the thing that's been great, is like you were talking about earlier. You could strip the Star Warsiness from this and it could be a great sci-fi novel, but at the same time, Thrawn has layered in those kind of rhyming elements still that help you feel comfortable, right? Like you kind of feel like you understand this guy, and yet at the same time, there's an air of mystery there that's still yet to be uncovered, and it leaves me, like you said, it just leaves me wanting to know more. And I in the way that they are looking to disrupt the Ascendancy, I thought was fascinating, because you were talking about how the Chiss Ascendancy is not a good thing. And one of the ways in which we see that here is that the big plan is Haplif is going to use the family's system and this kind of like feudal meritocracy type system against itself. And so the continual politics of everything, he's going to just throw that little bit of a wrench in there that hopefully will create basically a civil war. Almost World War I like, that if we move this one piece, right, then all of these dominoes will fall because of the way in which these tribes are all set up against one another and working against each other. But I think in all reality, this tribalism also shows us, when everything is politics, nothing is true. And it's hard to tell what is true then. And Haplif is using that against the Chiss, and I think it's beautiful.
I agree. I thought that the plan was so incredibly nuanced, and it was interesting. I thought that the memories interludes that Zahn puts in there were incredibly clever, because had the book been structured in such a way that these were not set aside as quasi-flashbacks, if we had instead put these through as the first third of the story, everything would have been a snail's pace. Mm-hmm. And so Zahn taking Haplif's plan and having these interludes so that we can take a breath, reset our brains, and get just a little bit of information given to us without it being exposition-y, winds up working to great advantage for this plan, because the plan, when you finally see what they're doing, there's no question about, well, why would they fall for, like, he's given you these little bite-sized nuggets. Zahn is a very cinematic writer. He understands that you need scenes in order to process the information. And I think it really helps that plan of Hapless go from convoluted to complex. And complex is better than convoluted. Everything makes sense when we get to that point.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, like, you're talking about Hapless plan and those interlude scenes, which I thought were really great additions to the book. Like you said, they kind of break things up, but they also help lay the foundation for exactly the way in which he's working out this plan, which is he's playing on the emotions of these young Chiss who are off on this wandering year. And by playing on their emotions, it shows how he's going to continue to play on people's emotional states to get them thinking emotionally and not logically at all, and therefore being able to manipulate them. Because when you make somebody react emotionally and not logically, you're bound to make a mistake. And that's one of the things that makes this, and that's what makes him and this whole section, like Jinxes and his plans, an incredible foil for Thrawn and his logic, right? Is that we're working on all of these characters who begin to not think logically about things, not put anything through any kind of testing or understanding. They're just thinking with their basest emotions of like greed and quote unquote love, or, self-preservation or desire for more power. And when you do that, you are at your basest instincts, and that's where we're most dangerous, when we're not thinking above anything but base instinct. And when you get somebody being emotional, it's easy to take advantage of them then. And I think, again, this is one of the things where when you look at like this idea of tribalism and emotionalism, it's maybe one of the most topical things that I've just ever seen in a book recently. And it's done really well, I think, to kind of shine a mirror, as the best sci-fi really does, as the best Star Wars has done, right? To shine a mirror on... And what's great about this is I can read into it what's going on today, right? But I can also see the historicity of this that Zahn is also pulling from throughout all, many different times, to where this has been used to great effect.
Yeah, and that's why I find it so interesting that basically the reflexive, I don't know. Basically, Thrawn goes from being the logical poison pill to all of this emotional planning and setting people against each other and playing on their greed and everything like that, to working for somebody who is essentially Jinxes, who does these exact things. And I find that interesting, because maybe what we'll find out, and I'm legitimately curious, maybe what we'll find out is that Jinxes' mistake winds up being that he doesn't enlist Thrawn. If he had found some way to leverage Thrawn the way that the Emperor does, but the Emperor is able to leverage Thrawn because Thrawn does have a loyalty to the Ascendancy that he recognizes. And so he works in Sidious's employ for his own ulterior motives. Jinxes is working to destroy the Ascendancy, so maybe that's the one reason he couldn't get Thrawn to work for him, why he doesn't bother trying to get Thrawn to work for him. Because, as we will see, is anybody who has Thrawn working for them has a tremendous advantage in every conceivable fashion. And it's interesting just to see him go from essentially, now it's not a one-to-one, obviously, but if we picture the Ascendancy as the Republic, he's working against Sidious's machinations, Jinxes' machinations here, right? Who's the Sidious of this analogy. And then we flop it over and he works for the Empire. and that winds up being the, he's basically working in reverse. Like it's just, I just think it's really interesting, and I think that can't, obviously it's not accidental. Zahn is having some fun with that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a great way to kind of see the story, is that Thrawn, in his going to what they call lesser space and, ending up working for the Emperor, ends up working for the very type of character that, we're most likely he's going to have brought down by the end of the series, but also is maybe the same character who ends type of character that gets him excommunicated. So I think that is kind of absolutely fascinating. And, it does show the danger. And, Haplif says wonderfully in this quote, he says, if anything, this insane family setup of yours makes it all the easier. All that ambition and infighting and suspicion are perfect for my kind of operation. And to, we didn't really talk about how in Haplif's plan, but his species is one to which allows him to be able to read the emotional state of somebody by touching them.
Right.
And that allows him to then be able to manipulate them all the better, which, if you're going to be a master manipulator, especially of people's emotions, being able to know what their emotional state is in response to what you're doing makes all the difference. And it's kind of brilliant, like he is, it's almost like he's tapping into each person's internal feed. And it allows him then to be able to use that to his full advantage. In many ways, basically, he's a betazoid, right? Who just has to use touch, and that allows him then to use his powers for evil instead of good. And so, I really love. Again, we see Jinxus using something like that to his full advantage. So. It's great.
Well, I mean, everybody we encounter in a way is a manipulator, and the only people who are not manipulators that we run across, Thalius is not a manipulator. She cares about Cherie. She doesn't want anything to happen to her. Oddly enough, Samacro, Samrak, whatever, the mid captain, he's not a manipulator. And that's what's so interesting about him is if he were different, he would be more apt to work against Thrawn from the inside. I think Lakinda lacks the manipulative side of things. I think Lakinda is one of those characters where she wants to hate Thrawn but can't find a way to. She's very much stuck in that zone. But everybody's a manipulator, and what I think is interesting to look at from that vantage point is Haplif needs touch to get to that point. Otherwise, he's lost. That's why the rancher, Lakfro, can overcome him. One person that he can't touch, it becomes a mystery to him that he can't plan for.
Right.
Whereas Thrawn can just observe at a distance, and then we have this, we have the Ascendancy doing all of its things, and then we have Jinxus, who sees from a different level. And so we have these concentric circles of manipulation. Haplif, I think, is when I read the name or say the name Haplif, I think of hapless. He doesn't realize that he's kind of fumbling around here. He thinks he's more clever than he is. And that's why I think that sort of like concentric circle thing works so well. Is you have the hapless one, then you have Thrawn, who's the competent one, and then you have Jinxus, who's working above Thrawn and accounting for him, as it were.
Well, and that's something that I think is really interesting here, too, and I'm glad that you bring it up, because Jinxus doesn't know about Thrawn until this book, and he's told by Quilly or the navigator,
Kalori,
who tells him, you need to watch out for this dude. This dude has the ability to basically bring you down. And he's like, oh, okay. And by the end of this book, he's like, oh no, I'm going to have to put this guy into my calculations. And I think that's really fascinating to see. And I like it. I like it a lot that many times Thrawn has been underestimated, and I think Jinxus even underestimated him. In fact, in some ways, he's kind of underestimated the Chiss, and yet at the same time, he doesn't. He thinks this is the thing. Like, he thinks he knows enough to be able to overcome any weaknesses he might have, and to me, that's fascinating, because is that the chink in his armor, to which he's overconfident? Because there's the thing. One of the things that makes Thrawn really interesting is he's willing to admit when he doesn't know something. Jinxus does not necessarily seem to be able to admit when he doesn't know something, and will that be his undoing?
I'm going to venture to say that Jinxus, I'm still not sure of what he does and doesn't know.
I think that's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the one X factor there in that calculation. But I think that the simple fact is, and I know I hit on this earlier, but the simple fact is, we're sitting here, we're talking about these characters. This is a Star Wars story. And I pause again, because we haven't once talked about any of the things that typically go along with Star Wars, but it's still a Star Wars story. It still has these lessons, right? Because what's the cardinal rule of Star Wars? You're supposed to be teaching the moral lesson at the core. It's not supposed to be a vanity piece. It's not supposed to be, a postmodern deconstruction of anything. It's supposed to be, okay, you have a morality tale and you're going to tell it. What I think is interesting is just the fact that this is a morality tale without a good guy at the center of it. And even, again, how would I feel about a Star Wars film where the main character isn't very present in it? But is always there at the same time. Like, I just think it's very interesting, and to go in with this, what I wonder is the thing that people always rebelled against with the prequels when they came out was, it's too much politics. The politics, come on, stop with the politics. Well, this is prequel era politics on steroids. This is an insane amount of politics, and with the same basic fundamental lesson that you can't trust anybody who's political. Like, it's just an impossibility. And then when you come across somebody who's bluntly honest and has no interest in the political game, the entire political system coalesces around itself. You're talking about these families are always at each other's throats. These families hate each other. These families are together because of this big, weird web of complex systems that they've put together to kind of bind them all together, tie them together, even though they don't really like each other. And then you bring in Thrawn, and it's that common enemy thing, right? Don't ever get between two dogs that are fighting, because then they're both going to bite you. They'll go back to fighting afterward, but Thrawn is now in the spot where he's in between the dogs. And it's just interesting because he keeps getting out from between them, but we know that with this third book, something's coming. So I actually want to ask you, I know we don't like to speculate when we talk about, books and movies and what's coming next and everything. Given everything we've gone through in this book, the only way I can see Thrawn truly being in trouble, quote unquote, is the fact that Thurfain is now the head of the Mitth. He's the patriarch of the Mitth. That's his big He can't get out from under that. Do you think it's as simple as Thurfain flexing? Because it seems to me that Thurfain is now in a situation where he can't move against Thrawn as freely as he would wish, being the patriarch. It's almost as if he's now been given a poison chalice at the end of this book.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you see it going? Like, what zaniness can Thrawn possibly get drawn into that gets him kicked out after he's been through everything we've seen in this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you were talking about all of these things that have been happening in the story. And one of the things that Thrawn throws in at the end is Lackfro, when he's having his confrontation with Haplif, talking about how he's wrong. About how family is what's important. And what he doesn't understand is that these are not just tribes, these are families. And that means friendship and loyalty and support and communication. And in the end, communication and true communication between peoples becomes the key. And that's even what breaks Thrawn through to getting people on his side that are not a part of his family, who thought he was playing this game, and who got told, look, Thrawn doesn't understand politics at all. He is hapless when it comes to politics, and therefore what he's saying to you is just the truth of the matter. And part of that is, and one of the things I think is interesting is to watch this idea of, like, true communication is the only way to overcome tribalism that could devolve this into a really bad system. But there is something different about family, where you're all part of something together, right? And you're all linked by something that is more than just a name. They say, and it's interesting, the same Star Trek, I was reading a Star Trek book and doing a literary treks on it here on the network soon. And the same idea of family came up in that book, and how, like, this idea in the end, blood is thicker than water. And there is something that is intangible and ineffable that comes with that. And therefore, that's just another layer that I think Zahn adds on this that's going to be really fascinating to see how this goes. Because, like you said, with Thurfain being made the leader of the Mitth, it does seem like a poison chalice, basically, for Thrawn, that he was now going to possibly have the power to get rid of Thrawn, even in a way that makes him see himself and the Mitth seem more like the heroes, but Thrawn like the villain.
I would just love to talk with Timothy Zahn and get to know what his extended family was like. Because your statement about blood thicker than water and everything, the concept of how the Ascendancy as a family relates to itself in terms of, like, the large extended family sort of situation it's not unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. And so I would love just to find out if Mr. Zahn had awkward Christmases the way that I was, or whatever holiday you want to insert there, because there is that idea, especially with a very large family, an extended family, that you do go for a while under power of the idea that, there's something greater bonding us together, but eventually those bonds wear thin. And what I'm going to be interested to see is, this is called Thrawn Ascendancy. I still wonder what the Ascendancy looks like at the end of all of this.
Yeah.
Because they've already dropped hints. There have been 9 ruling families. There were 10. There's been as few as 1 in the past, or 3. What's coming with that? Because there's no way the Ascendancy comes out of this unscathed. And I think it would be a wonderfully ironic twist to have a book series with the word Ascendancy in it that features the downfall of a system.
No, I think that's and it does definitely lead into a really interesting place. I think that's the thing that makes this so fascinating as a series, is that in many ways it does seem like we are kind of in the prequel zone for the Ascendancy. And like you said, their kind of eventual downfall. And part of that seems to be because somebody is so hell-bent on getting rid of the very thing that would make them last longer.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is that resistance to change.
Yeah.
In the worst possible way. To new ways of thinking. It reminds me of in Star Trek where Bones is like, new ideas, fresh ideas must be tolerant, or something like that. It's just...
Oh, no. I don't want to be that guy.
Go ahead, because I'm getting it wrong. So go, please, just correct me.
It's Star Trek 3, it's
Yes,
Kirk when they see the Excelsior, and Scotty says, and if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a wagon.
Thank you.
No, Mr. Scott. Young minds, fresh ideas, be tolerant.
Exactly. That's a...
Sorry.
No.
I hate being that guy.
I'm glad you were there because I was just sounding like an idiot. So,
no, you weren't.
Yeah.
You were sounding like a normal person who doesn't memorize one of the lesser Star Trek movies.
Well, I personally love Star Trek, but that's a whole other discussion for another time.
I love parts of it.
I think, but again, I think that's what's really interesting here, and I think that's one of the places as we kind of get to rating this book. I'm really interested then to see where you end up with Greater Good.
This is easily a solid 4. If I'm rating it as a Star Wars fan, strictly a Star Wars fan, it's probably closer to a 5, because if a Star Wars fan came to me, especially one of longstanding or anybody who has even been with the series since, say, Rebels, and they said, should I read Thrawn Ascendancy, Greater Good? I'd be, yes, right now, go out, buy it, get the darn book. 4 solid stars means that this is a book I can even recommend, not to everyone, because not everybody likes science fiction for some reason, but this is a book what's really mind-bending about it is, with the exception of a few things, like the concept of the Skywalkers and stuff like that, this is just a good science fiction book. I think you can even come into this. You don't even need to read the first book. So even by the rules of sequels that I have this cockamamie idea in my head that it's like, well, you should be able to jump into a movie without having seen the first one, and, like Terminator 2 or The Empire Strikes Back or something like that. You could jump into this. You don't need, it's better if you read the first one, but you don't need to. And so I don't know. I might be talking myself up into an even higher rating, but I'm going to stick right now with a solid 4, with a little green up arrow with it.
It's understandable. I'd say for me, I guess I don't necessarily think in all those categories. As just somebody who read this book, and I think it's phenomenal, and I'm going to give it a 5. It's just a great book. So and part of that is because. Like you said, this is not just a good Star Wars book. I think it's a good sci-fi book, and therefore for it to be able to transcend from tie-in fiction to just good sci-fi fiction, I think it deserves to be rated as a 5.
You know what? You're absolutely right. You don't hear that often when I'm talking to Matt.
It's true. It's true. I'm gonna clip that and just replay it over and over again.
You should play it while you're falling asleep. You'll have the most pleasant dreams in the world. I just went in and updated my Goodreads rating to 5 stars because you are gosh darn right. You are absolutely right. I just sat there and said, you don't even need to read the first book, and this is a great book, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Go ahead and read the book. It's fine. Yeah. I could recommend this to anybody who's willing to, just wants to read a good book. And as a testament to that, the little tidbit I shared with you, I basically read like 350 pages in a day. And I'm not the world's fastest reader by any stretch.
This is true.
I tore through this book because I just enjoyed it so much. So, yeah, I know. Trust me, I know I'm not a fast reader.
I only say that because we did push this back a week for you, but your life is super busy. You're a dad, and we're always just thankful that you make the time to come on. And honestly, I think, I remember us talking about whether you would be on to cover this one, and you're like, you know what, it's Thrawn, I need to be there, and so I'm glad that you were, because it makes for the expansiveness of the discussion we were able to have tonight, and the type of discussions. This is what you want from a good Star Wars book, right? And so this is what has made the Thrawn series, for me personally, some of the best stuff that's come out of this new canon, whether it's been the books that he created while he's on the Empire side, or, now this. I've personally loved every single one of them. So I'm super excited to see what's going to happen in this third book, and where we go with the character. But, John, we do a little thing here on the 602 Club, where we recommend something to everybody. And so I'm really interested to see what you would like to recommend to everybody this week.
And you really think I'm not in flop sweats trying to figure out, because I forget every gosh darn time I come on here? You think I'm not?
No, I think you are. I just like putting you in that position. It's really fun.
You got to give you a heads up before we start recording. But in all honesty, what I'm going to throw out there, and it's something on Amazon Prime right now. I wasn't nuts for it. I'm going to qualify it as I wasn't nuts for it, but other people might enjoy it more than I did. There is a documentary called In Search of the Last Action Heroes.
Ooh.
It's an amusing retrospective documentary with interviews, with everybody from Eric Roberts to Zach Penn to different actors and actresses, and Cynthia Rothrock is in there, and stuff like that, basically talking about the evolution of the action movie, but with a very special focus on the 80s. And while I felt it was a little indulgent and maybe a little overlong, I think that probably there are plenty of action movie fans that will look on it with kinder eyes than I did. So since it is included in Amazon Prime right now, I would say, if you're a fan of action movies, it's a good thing to have on, while you're sort of doing the dishes or something like that, which is how I watched it, just sort of like doing stuff around the house, watching it. It's a good time. In Search of the Last Action Heroes.
Nice. That does sound like fun. And definitely something I might even check out there. I'm going to recommend, I really enjoyed getting a chance to revisit a movie, and I often enjoy being able to do that, especially if it's, in an upgraded format. And getting to do that with Indiana Jones was fantastic. I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, just came out in 4K along with the set. And man, Indiana Jones is just so damn perfect, especially Raiders of the Lost Ark. It is just a phenomenal film, and it looks gorgeous. And even if you already have the series, it was worth the upgrade, I think, just for the way it looks. Indiana Jones is a movie that is so special to me anyway, just especially Raiders, with the way that it changed my life in the same way Star Wars did, with what I thought of for action film heroes, and I wanted to be Indiana Jones. Who didn't? So, I just highly recommend picking up this set. I can't wait to watch the rest of them. But, Raiders was just a phenomenal experience again. And I know a friend of ours who's also, he had gotten to see it in a theater because it was playing in a theater. So if it's playing in the theater in your area, go see it on the big screen. Like, I'm devastated it is not in my area. I looked. I would do just about most things to go see Raiders of the Lost Ark on the big screen. So I
had the good fortune to see it on the big screen when it came out for its 30th anniversary. I saw it in the theater when I was a kid, and then I saw it for the 30th anniversary. I can only imagine how much better the digital print looks now that it's in 4K.
Oh,
so
man.
I would love to see it just for that, because there's one specific shot from the Blu-ray transfer where something weird happens. I don't point it out to people because I don't want to ruin their viewing experience, but there is a very specific shot in the beginning that absolutely drives me nuts from something happened in the transfer process. And it drives me batty. Like, I have to just look away from the screen. Like, I'm like, okay, here it comes. Look away. Okay, now we're back. Sort of thing. So, yeah, it's weird.
It happens. But,
yeah.
If people do want to catch up with you, John, see, of course, what else you've got going on besides, guesting on the 602 Club from your guest suite, where can people find you?
Well, I actually do everything just so I can earn this spot here on the 602 Club, but you can find me out there as Kessel Junkie on your social network of choice, KESSELJUNKIE. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network, where I co-host House Lights, which is a series where we look at the works of directors one career at a time from beginning to pseudo finish. I mean, if they're still around and making films, it's up to this point in time, as it were. And you can also find me co-hosting a Star Wars focused show called Aggressive Negotiations with one Mr. Matthew Rushing,
which is a blast. I hope you'll check that out. I love doing that over there on the Nerd Party with you. Of course, you could find me over on the Nerd Party as well, a retired show because we finished, but Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, where we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. Social media, hit me up with Matt Rushing02 on any of those social media platforms. You'll find me there. I'd love to have a conversation with you. You can also find me here on the network. Not only have John and I been on the 602 Club a lot, but we are actually going to have a little surprise resurgence of Snyder Cuts. We got a fun episode that's going to be coming out of that soon. We found something that we could talk about there, so we're excited to do that. And of course, you can also find me doing Larry Treks, as I mentioned earlier, talking about Star Trek books, as well as The Orb, where I talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. But thank you, of course, as always, so much for joining us. And may the Force be with you.
Thank you.